In today's video, we will be retelling the story of one of John Mayer's most iconic guitars of all time, the 64 Stratocaster. There is just so much information to cover when discussing this incredibly important guitar, and I want to go over it all in detail and not skip anything. So I'm not planning on this being a very short video, so sit back, relax, and I hope you enjoy the story of John Mayer's 64 Stratocaster. So John's 64 Stratocaster, we have to first clarify that this guitar is in fact vintage. It is not a custom shop or master-built reproduction of a 1964 Stratocaster, which is something that I do see is talked about online a little bit, and one piece of misinformation I want to clarify right away. This guitar also gets quite often confused with John's SRV signature Stratocaster, which sports a very similar aesthetic, but obviously these are two very different and distinct guitars. When it comes to Stratocasters produced in 1964 specifically, like John's, there are a few details that are unique to this era that I think are important to mention before we get further along in the video. Now, 64 was a transition year for Fender, and when it comes to Stratocasters, depending on when they were produced in 1964, there will actually be some differences in these guitars. Even though you might have two 1964 Stratocasters, there will be some differences depending on when they were made. Now, Strats produced in early 64 will have the spaghetti logo as well as black bottom 63 style pickups, while Strats produced in later 1964 will feature the transition logo and gray bottom, essentially 65 style pickups on them. So some pretty big differences in terms of the pickups specifically that we are interested in. When it comes to Mayer's 64 Stratocaster, it features the spaghetti logo on the headstock, indicating that it is an early 64 Stratocaster with what is most likely the black bottom 63 style pickups in it. And another piece that helps to confirm what pickups are actually in the 64 Strat comes from the development of the PRS Silver Sky. John mentions that the Silver Sky was developed based off of a 64 Stratocaster, and the pickups being designated 635JM are actually in between a 63 and a 64 style pickup, 63 and a half if you take it 635, which also kind of indirectly confirms that the pickups in the 64 Stratocaster are those 63 style black bottom pickups. Now, our story begins in 2005 during the John Mayer Trio era when John acquired the 64 Stratocaster. In an interview that he did in 2016 for the MSN forum, he reflected on when he first bought the guitar and the reason why he loved the specs so much. I'm going to read from this interview here and quote for you guys now. I bought the guitar in 2005 or so, maybe 2006. It's my favorite spec combination, sunburst with tortoise pickguard and rosewood fretboard. You see a lot of basses with that look. I think Dila had one the whole time we were playing together. But guitars are more rare. It needed a refret, so I sent it to Chris Fleming at the Fender Custom Shop to do the job, and I believed I asked Renee to put a 5-way switch in place of the 3-way. In fact, I remember having a conversation with a couple of guys in the room as to whether it would devalue the guitar, and I think I got yelled at. So right from John you hear that sunburst with the tortoiseshell guard and rosewood fretboard is his favorite spec combination, and I think it's pretty clear that that was his favorite spec combination really since day one. Of course, his Stevie Ray Vaughan Stratocaster being modified with the black guard replaced with a tortoiseshell pickguard. Of course, that guitar having Pau Ferrero instead of actual rosewood, but you get the picture. And it's the exact same way with his Fender Artist Series signature Stratocaster. One of the spec options you could order that guitar in was sunburst with a tortoiseshell guard and rosewood fretboard. Now, I do have to think that when it comes to the 64 Stratocaster, that the tortoiseshell pickguard on that guitar is in fact original, because the way John says that guitars from back in the 60s with that spec combination are more rare, that leads me to theorize that that is the original pickguard on that guitar. Of course, it wouldn't be that rare to just find a nice vintage sunburst Stratocaster and then swap something like a Spitfire torque guard on it. As for the modifications that John did to the 64 Strat, the guitar now has Dunlop 6105 frets on it, and of course the other modification being switching from that 3-way blade to a 5-way blade to allow for those 4th and 2nd pickup positions. And we're going to touch on the 4th position especially a little later on in this video, because at the time I don't really think that John would have realized that making this change from a 3-way blade to a 5-way blade would actually be so impactful and really kind of define what the guitar is known as going forward, but that's for just a little later on in the video. Now, as far as the year that John purchased the 64 Stratocaster, we know it was probably 2005, and as John mentions, it might have been 2006. However, the very first performance with the 64 Stratocaster was in April of 2006, so it would have had to have been within the first few months of 2006. As I mentioned earlier on in the video, the earliest performance that we can absolutely confirm that the 64 Stratocaster was used for was in Arizona at the Tempe Festival with the John Mayer Trio, the very last show of the John Mayer Trio era, in fact. Not only was this the live debut of the 64 Stratocaster, but it also was the live debut of Dumble Steel String Singer 002. John had actually bought both of these pieces of gear around the same time, which is pretty crazy to think about. John said, "I picked up Steel String Singer 002 around the same time as the 64. The 64 through the Steel String Singer gave Renee and I goosebumps when we first plugged it in." After that John Mayer Trio performance, the 64 Stratocaster saw no more live use because John moved on to recording and finishing Continuum. Now, you might know the 64 Strat as the guitar that John would use to perform Slow Dancing in a Burning Room on. But did you know that it's actually the guitar that he used in the studio to record Slow Dancing on? Back in 2022, Sweetwater did a breakdown of the guitar track on Continuum for Slow Dancing in a Burning Room, titled Iconic Guitar Tones, John Mayer's Slow Dancing in a Burning Room. And in that, they reached out to Chad Franskowiak, who provided some details on the original recording. The key point here that we are interested in is that Chad revealed John's main guitar was a 1964 Stratocaster. And this makes sense because, as we know, John loves to play whatever guitar he wrote a song and used in the studio on live. We just see that as a quite common theme with John, and for him to move on to eventually making that guitar the Slow Dancing in a Burning Room guitar makes a lot of sense. And I would heavily speculate that the 64 Stratocaster is probably on more than just Slow Dancing in a Burning Room. When you listen to Continuum front to back, I'm sure you hear it somewhere else, but we have no confirmation of its use outside of being the main guitar for Slow Dancing in a Burning Room. And when it comes to the studio version of Slow Dancing in a Burning Room, I'm one of those people who will die on the hill that John used the middle position on the 64 Stratocaster. When you truly just sit back and listen to the recorded guitar tone, it definitely sounds like the middle position, not position 4. However, of course, live, position 4 is the quintessential Slow Dancing in a Burning Room sound, especially on the 64 Stratocaster. And remember when I said we'd come back to John modifying that 3-way blade to a 5-way? Well, it's really funny to me that just how important that 4th position sound on the 64 Stratocaster would actually become, as that is the sound of Slow Dancing in a Burning Room live, and it's a position on the guitar that was never intended the way the guitar was designed to actually have that 4th position with the neck and middle pickups together. After Continuum was finished, you would be forgiven to think that the guitar that John used to record one of his most popular songs on for the record with would be used heavily live. However, this was just not the case. At the Webster Hall launch party performance for Continuum, the 64 Strat was not used at all. And then on October 30th of 2006 at the Chapel in Melbourne, Australia, the 64 Stratocaster was used, but not for Slow Dancing. That was the Monterey. The 64 Strat was used for Vultures over the Gold Leaf. So it's just kind of a really weird guitar selection at that one show. And much like both of these performances for Slow Dancing in a Burning Room, John would elect to use the Monterey Stratocaster as the Slow Dancing in a Burning Room guitar throughout the entire Continuum tour. Of course, that includes Where the Light Is, in which the 64 Strat did not make an appearance at all during that just absolutely incredible and iconic live Mayer show. And it's a pretty similar story when it comes to the Battle Studies era as well, John electing not to use the 64 Stratocaster at all. However, for Slow Dancing in a Burning Room during the Battle Studies tour, John actually moved away from the Monterey Stratocaster and started using the black one a lot more for that song during that era. Before we move on from the Continuum and Battle Studies eras, there is one performance at the very end of 2008 in what you could call the transitionary period between Continuum and Battle Studies, where John actually did bring out the 64 Stratocaster, and it's for the Grammy nomination concert on December 3rd of 2008 with B.B. King, and the 64 Stratocaster being the guitar John chose to use, which is kind of interesting that the 64 was a guitar he just wasn't using live really at all. And then for this one-off performance with B.B. King, it's what he brought out. So maybe he was looking for a guitar with just that vintage vibe, and the 64 just really footed the bill. When it comes to the Born and Raised in Paradise Valley era, all of a sudden, as if overnight, the 64 Stratocaster was used on a nightly basis for multiple songs, but always guaranteed to be used on Slow Dancing in a Burning Room live. And it's just kind of this weird transition between eras. Battle Studies Continuum, not used at all. Born and Raised and Forward, it was used every single night. When we look back on the Born and Raised in Paradise Valley era, it's clear that John just loved that guitar. The way he played it and just how insane a lot of those performances were with that guitar really just speaks volumes to how quickly and how strongly John bonded with that guitar. And there are so many fantastic performances and tones to choose from. I think probably one of the most well-known is the Slow Dancing in a Burning Room performance in August of 2013 on Letterman. And also in 2013, we would get a follow-up to my favorite Mayer collaboration of all time by an absolute landslide. It's not even close to any other thing in my opinion. It's just that good. John Mayer and Keith Urban at Crossroads. Now, in 2013 for Crossroads, John and Keith would perform Don't Let Me Down, and John would use the 64 Stratocaster. And then, on January 27th of 2014, John and Keith would reunite and perform the same song for the Grammy TV special salute to the Beatles. Again, of course, John using the 64 Stratocaster for both performances. And those two performances of Don't Let Me Down with Keith Urban, I think, are ones a lot of Mayer fans really go back to and just listen to frequently, not only because they are fantastic, but because the guitar tones and just the way John and Keith play together is truly special and incredible in my mind. And those are two really great performances that highlight the 64 Stratocaster in John's hands. Yeah, those performances of Don't Let Me Down with Keith Urban, those are just absolute highlights of John and that guitar in my opinion. In 2014 as well, we also have a gear talk that John did on Periscope. I'm going to play for you guys the part where he talks about the 64 Strat.
You guys might know that guitar. This somehow quickly became the kind of like go-to stage guitar over the last 2 or 3 years. You've seen that guitar a lot. There's that. Screenshot of that bar right there. And here's what's cool about it. I mean, when I got it, it didn't have as much of that on it. That's me. You can see those pick lines there. That's also me. And that's probably a little bit of me, though. not sure how much. But that guitar is actually, here's the thing about the years. You look back and you go, oh, I've had this guitar for 10 years. I mean, I've had this guitar for almost exactly 10 years. And the first time this guitar was on a record was on the Continuum record. And you go, wow, that's 10 years ago. So it's not like you get older. Shit just gets farther behind you. That's about it.
It's really cool to hear John talk about this guitar in such a casual way. One of my favorite pieces of that was when he just kind of highlights, okay, that wear there, that was a little bit of me, that was some of me there as well. Oh yeah, I did that. Just kind of talking about how the guitar, when it came to him, already had lived 50 years. And then he's just part of its life now as the current custodian of that instrument. And one of the main key takeaways that I truly believe is from this Periscope Gear talk is how he just mentions that suddenly the guitar almost overnight became one of his main stage guitars. It's just kind of funny how that happens sometimes. Yeah, it's there, it's there, it's there. Man, I love this guitar. I gotta play it every night. It's just how it kind of happened with him and the 64. John, of course, also mentioned the guitar being used on Continuum, and that's the first time it was used on a record, and I really wish he would have dived into that a little bit more. Of course, we know Slow Dancing in a Burning Room is what he recorded with the 64, but I just wish he kind of would have elaborated and maybe gave us some more clues or insight as to what that guitar has actually been used on in the studio, not just for Continuum, but other records up until that point as well. Now, before we move on from 2014, there is one moment, one thing that happened that year that really would end up defining John's gear trajectory for the rest of his year, the gear that you associate with them, and the gear that he would use. This was just a very crazy moment, and it's very impactful in terms of the relationship between John and the 64 Stratocaster. On Twitter in 2014, John announced that he was parting ways with Fender, that he was no longer a Fender artist, and that his signature Stratocaster was no longer being produced. The tie with Fender was completely severed, and the 64 Stratocaster plays just an absolute massive role in what we all know was coming from that point on, and we're going to get to that in just a little bit. The next era we have to discuss is the search for everything, and like the Born and Raised in Paradise Valley era, the 64 Stratocaster was used heavily throughout the entire tour. And during this tour, the 64 Stratocaster, of course, being known at this point as the Slow Dancing in a Burning Room guitar, it also became known as the Helpless guitar. And Helpless, one of my favorite John tracks of all time, just sounds right on the 64 Stratocaster, and it's kind of led me to heavily theorize that that's actually the guitar that John used to at least record the main components of the song in the studio. He would consistently use that song for Helpless, and it just sounds so perfect. That third position for Helpless, you just can't beat it when it comes to the 64 Stratocaster. Another one of my favorite performances from the Search for Everything tour was from the O2 Arena in London, and John performed a song he rarely performs even with the trio set on the tour, and that was Good Love Is On The Way with the 64. And as I did mention with Helpless, the third position on that guitar just sounds incredible, and for Good Love Is On The Way, that was no exception either. It sounded absolutely brilliant in position 3 for Good Love Is On The Way. And it's kind of cool as well to see the 64 Strat start to make its way into a little bit of John Mayer trio stuff. We do also have in 2016 for the Apollo Theater show, John using the 64 Stratocaster, of course, for Vultures during that performance. It's funny talking about that Apollo Theater John Mayer Trio performance because in my mind as I was sitting here discussing it for the video, I was thinking, oh wait, there's rehearsal footage from that show as well that John had posted and they did Who Did You Think I Was? But I remember he used a Strat, but in my mind I was like, it wasn't the black one he used, was it the 64? And then sure enough, I just went and checked, and the footage doesn't lie. So we get a really awesome look at Who'd You Think I Was? Not a real live performance, mind you, but just John had posted some footage of them testing out the song with the 64 Stratocaster during rehearsals for that show.
Let's see how it feels. Let's see how it feels.
Not only is that rehearsal footage just a really great look at John using the 64 for a trio song that you really wouldn't expect him to use it for, but also just a great listen to the tones that John was aiming for the Search for Everything tour as a whole, and that's going to bring us right back around to the 2017 Search for Everything tour. And while the 64 Strat was one of John's main guitars throughout the Search for Everything tour, something also happened during this tour, of course, that really kind of changed everything. On April 11th in Chicago, John debuted the PRS Silver Sky. And the real crazy thing is, when you think about it, just how much of an impact in the short while that 64 Strat became John's #1 guitar along with the black one, how much of an impact that guitar had on the overall design of the PRS Silver Sky. The Silver Sky is essentially a modern version of John's 64 Stratocaster. We know the pickups were designed based off of a 63 to a 64 Stratocaster, like John's early 1964 Strat with those black bottom 63 style pickups in it. And the neck shape is pretty much exactly the same, just a replica of the neck on John's 64 Stratocaster. And of course, while the Silver Sky has evolved since its birth, the foundation of that guitar is really rooted in that 64 Strat of John's. So the PRS Silver Sky is officially born, and for the remainder of the Search for Everything tour, John would be road testing prototypes of that guitar leading up to its official release in 2018. This then, of course, leads us on to what is one of my favorite eras of John's of all time for his lead tones, the 2019 World Tour. And one really cool thing that we see with John and the 64 Stratocaster at the rehearsals for the 2019 World Tour is that the 64 Stratocaster is the very first guitar that John used to perform I Guess I Just Feel Like live on. And much like the Born and Raised in Paradise Valley era, the 2019 World Tour featured so many incredible performances with the 64 Stratocaster. It's just hard to pick one to highlight in this video for you guys, but this is one of my favorite solos that John did for Slow Dancing in a Burning Room during the 2019 World Tour. And if you're curious as to what pedals he used during this entire performance, I've done a full breakdown of all the pedals that you can see John stepping on very clearly in this footage on my channel. I'll card that video up above and link it in the description down below for you all to check out if you choose to. Now, the one thing about the 2019 World Tour that you might have different opinions on based on just your feel about the Silver Sky is that this is the very first tour where the Silver Sky was actually a thing, it being actually a fully produced guitar and model. And during the 2019 World Tour, we slowly saw Stratocasters get used less and less, and all of a sudden it was kind of a balance of what would John use for even a song like Slow Dancing in a Burning Room. Would he perform it that night with a Silver Sky? Would he perform it with the 64? You just didn't know because the Silver Sky was getting used that often and that much. And this is really the tour where Stratocasters as a whole begun to get phased out. What is kind of crazy when you think about the 2019 World Tour is that during those final shows of that tour in October, I don't think a lot of us realized that at the time that would be the last time we'd actually see the 64 Strat and other Stratocasters for that matter in John's hands, at least until present day 2023 of me making this video. And I went back to those final dates of the 2019 World Tour, and I initially assumed that the 64 Stratocaster would probably have been used for Manchester on October 18th of that year. And it was not. I then went back to October 16th in Dublin, looked through the entire set list and footage. The guitar wasn't used during that performance either, and it wasn't even used night 2 in London at the O2 Arena on October 14th. The very last time we saw the 64 Strat in John's hands was for Slow Dancing in a Burning Room on October 13th, night 1 in London at the O2 Arena. I don't know, maybe it's just some unintentional foreshadowing from John in that the last 3 shows of that tour to close it out, we only saw the Silver Sky being used. No Strats at all were used for those typical Mayer sounds. It's just kind of crazy when you think about it that he closes out that tour with just the Silver Sky, and that's kind of where we are present day. So of course this brings us to the Sob Rock Tour, and as I just mentioned, John puts down the Stratocasters in favor of the Silver Sky full time. The one interesting part about the Sob Rock Tour is that we know for a fact that John had both the Black One and the 64 Stratocaster with him during that tour. They just weren't used, but they were there with him backstage in the guitar racks, maybe him playing them backstage, but they were with him on the tour, at least for some shows. And that leads us up to present day, where the story of John Mayer's 64 Stratocaster has kind of taken a pause. I do hope and genuinely believe that one day we will return to some sort of equilibrium where both the Stratocasters, at least John's main Strats, and the Silver Sky coexist on stage, and you get some sort of mixture of modern tones with the Silver Sky and then the classic Mayer tones with the Black One, 64, maybe the Monterey and the Gold Leaf as well, but just At some point, I genuinely believe we will hit an equilibrium where both guitars coexist on stage. And John, even during the kind of launch and press of the Silver Skies release, said, this guitar is not meant to replace a Stratocaster, it's meant to coexist with one. I think was his exact words, coexist. And unfortunately right now, that's not a thing with John. It's just full on to the Silver Sky Live. As for the next time we will see the 64 Strat and just Stratocasters in general return to main stage use with John, it's of course impossible to really say, but if I had to kind of give any opinion of mine on the situation, I feel like the next tour for the next album will still be pretty much all, if not 100%, Silver Skies. I think after the next album and tour, that tour, we will probably see a somewhat return to a balanced equilibrium where both guitars do in fact coexist on stage and John is using both of them again. Right now he does seem to be all in on the PRS Silver Sky, and I think one tour is maybe too little of time for him to go back to bringing out Strats kind of full time again at least. So that's kind of my opinion, but we can hope that that equilibrium and balance is reached sooner. And that concludes the story of John Mayer's 64 Stratocaster. If you made it to the end of this video and enjoyed it, I would really appreciate you giving the video a thumbs up just for all my hard effort and to let you know that you enjoyed the video. This is going to be, I feel like, just an absolute long video, but I really genuinely do hope you learned something and enjoyed just kind of having what we know about this guitar concised and kind of put together in one singular video. As well, if you haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel, please consider doing so. That just lets me know I'm doing a good job with my content and that you guys want to see me continue on the channel essentially as it keeps growing. I also have done the same style of video, if you did like this one, around John Crew's Masterbuilt Sonic Blue Stratocaster. I'll link that video in the description down below as well. If you like this video, I'm sure you will love that one. Also, it just was really cool to talk about that guitar in the similar way as well, and that kind of inspired this video when you guys seem to really enjoy that one too. And if there are any other of John's guitars as well you'd like to see me make another video like those two on, please let me know in the comments down below. But seriously guys, I appreciate all of you again if you've stuck with me till the very end of what I assume is a very long video. So take care you guys, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.
Anyway, go ahead and click the subscribe button if you like what you see.